You didn't walk away because you were weak. You just stayed too long. In relationships where everyone needed you except when you needed to be heard. You used to be the one who reached out first. The one who remembered birthdays. The one who always asked, "Have you eaten?" The one who fixed every little thing so the relationship wouldn't fall even by one step. And then one day, you stopped trying. Not because you changed, but because you realized, no matter how hard you tried, you were still the only one holding that love together. You didn't get angry. You didn't cry out in the middle of the night. You just began to retreat one unsent message at a time. One plan you stopped making. One dinner you ate alone, and no one noticed you used to cook, for two. They said you were cold. They said you were distant, but they didn't know the feeling. That feeling of still being present, while no one sees you. No one asks, "Are you tired?" No one looks deep enough to see you've been holding the whole relationship together, with nothing but silence and patience. And then one day, you go truly quiet. Not to rebel, but to protect yourself. Not because you don't love anymore, but because you're too drained to keep loving while losing yourself. You're not lonely. You're healing in the only way you know how right now. Returning to yourself. No explanation. No blame. No expectations. Just peace. Finally, peace. And if you're in that chapter of life, the one where no one saw how hard you tried, stay with this story. Because maybe it's your story too. And for the first time, no one will rush you to move on. Only someone who understands. For a man to go quiet, it means he once spoke so much, and no one listened. You used to be that kind of man. The man who always remembered anniversaries, who kept checking in, even when all he got back were short replies. The man who waited by the car longer than he was told, but never complained. The man who noticed the little things, the dish she liked, the kind of music she listened to, the way she gently squeezed your hand when she was tired. You called first, so no one else had to. You explained things first, so no one would misunderstand. You adjusted yourself sometimes, even the parts you used to be proud of, just to be more in sync with the one beside you. People called you a good man. They introduced you to others with admiration. He's very patient. Oh? He always listens. Oh? He's the kind of man who would never leave anyone. Oh? They were right. But no one ever asked, "Are you tired?" No one asked if all that listening was ever just one-sided. No one asked whether your silence on the balcony after a long day was peace or exhaustion. No one asked if you felt yourself slowly disappearing from always being the one who tried more. Your patience wasn't an endless gift. It had limits. But because you always smiled, always said, "It's okay," always got up to do one more thing for someone else, no one noticed how far that line had been pushed. Your kindness slowly became a role you didn't dare step out of, because if you stopped, you feared you'd let someone down. You didn't want to be a burden, so you kept enduring. You didn't want to be called different, so you kept forcing yourself to be the kind, reliable man. But the cost of limitless kindness is that you start giving up on yourself. Little hobbies disappear. Plans just for you get postponed, then vanish. Quiet time only lives in memory, and your eyes, though still looking at her, no longer have the light of someone who feels seen, understood, and appreciated. You used to be everyone's support. People got used to you always being there. Used to you, never saying no. And what happens when a man who always said yes finally goes silent? At first, no one notices, because they're too used to you holding on a bit longer. One more time, one more sacrifice. But inside, you know, each one more is a piece of you fading, bit by bit, corner by corner, until you no longer recognize the person in the mirror. And from that moment, you're no longer the man who's always there. Not because you're selfish, but because you finally realized everyone leans on you except you. And if you keep playing that role, one day you'll have nothing left to give, because you've given away all of yourself. That's no longer kindness. That's a deliberate disappearance. Quiet, gradual, but very real. No one left you. No goodbye. No slammed door. No big fight strong enough to break everything. And because of that, everyone thinks you're fine. Still there. Still the man they've always known. The one who's always available. Always initiates. Always shows up when needed. But what they don't know is, you've already started pulling away. Not out of anger. Not with a statement like, "I'm done." Oh. But with small actions almost no one notices. You stop texting, "Good morning," because no one ever asked. "Are you okay today?" You stopped making weekend plans. Because every invitation always came from you. You stopped explaining your feelings. Because you've done it before, and no one truly listened. Bit by bit. You withdrew. Not to run away, but to breathe, to see if anyone would notice your silence was a wordless cry for help. But no one asked. No one noticed you had disappeared from the conversations. No one saw you, stopped reaching out. No one wondered why you had changed. And then you understood. You weren't abandoned. You just weren't held on to. You didn't blame them. You weren't angry at anyone. Because you understood, people only hold on to what they're afraid to lose. And you had become so familiar that they thought, he'll always be there. He's probably fine. He's probably just busy. You used to show up with all you had, but when you stopped initiating, you stopped being seen. And that is the most painful moment, not when someone leaves, but when you realize whether you stay or go, it makes no difference. That invisibility doesn't crash down. It seeps into your days. Like a phone that no longer rings. Like messages that are seen but never replied to. Like the eyes across from you looking through you, instead of stopping where you are. You're not angry at them. You just begin to understand. Maybe you were once important to them, but not enough to be held onto when you stop trying. And when a man goes from being the center to being an option, he doesn't speak up. He just quietly takes a step back, then another. No one stops him. No one says, "Don't go." And so, he keeps walking. Men don't disappear in a burst of anger. They disappear after waiting too long in silence, and one day, when people look around and don't see you anymore, they'll think you suddenly withdrew. But no, you started fading a long time ago. From that last time you tried and no one noticed. From the day you needed an embrace and only silence came. You're not there anymore. Not because you stopped loving, but because you finally understood. Staying in a place where no one sees you hurts more than walking away. It wasn't a big shock. No major event came crashing down to break him. Just an afternoon like any other. Except it was his birthday. No morning wishes. No message asking what he wanted to eat. No surprise plans. No one remembered. He wasn't angry. He didn't expect cake or a big party. It's just that, in that moment, sitting alone by the window with a cup of coffee slowly going cold, he realized something far deeper. If he disappeared tomorrow, who would truly feel the emptiness? Not because of the convenience he brought, not because of the things he used to do, but because of him, his very being, his unconditional presence. That thought didn't come from weakness. It came from clarity. Clarity so sharp it sent chills down his spine, because he realized it's very likely no one really knows who he is when he no longer serves a role. He wasn't someone remembered for his laughter or presence. He was someone remembered when people needed a favor. He was the name in the contact list people tapped when things got urgent. Not the person someone thought of, just to say, "Are you doing okay?" And in that moment, he didn't feel sad, just empty. A kind of emptiness that isn't loud, doesn't tear you apart, but just sits there, quietly, like a blank space no one continues to write on. His whole life, he had been the one who cared. The one who always asked, "Did you arrive safely?" The one who remembered every small detail to make others feel loved. But that day, no one asked if he was okay. No one mentioned the day he was born. Just a few work messages, a missed call from the bank, and dinner self-cooked, self-cleaned, self-eaten in soft music, just to soften the silence growing too loud. He once believed if he was good enough, sincere enough, consistent enough, people would cherish him. But no one taught him this. You can be loved for being useful, but never be loved for being you. And that truth was what made him shift. Not betrayal, not someone walking away, but silence, stretched too long, until he understood his existence wouldn't leave a gap if one day he vanished. And when a man realizes that, he doesn't get angry, doesn't blame, doesn't scream for fairness. He simply stands up, clears the dishes, turns off the kitchen light, and walks into complete silence, not to hide, but to stop existing as someone only kept around because others need him, not because they love him. From that day on, he no longer lived to be acknowledged. He started living to stop betraying himself. He wasn't trying to find someone new, didn't rush into patchwork relationships, didn't sign up for dates, didn't text old flames, didn't try to prove to the world that he was okay. He just stayed with himself. For the first time in years, he wasn't busy becoming someone for someone else. No, he stepped into the house where there used to be laughter, warm lights, conversations about things that once felt like forever. Now it was empty. The door closed without a sound. The turn of the lock was soft. Only the silence inside was loud. The sofa was still there, but no one leaned on his shoulder. The kitchen was still clean, but cold like a showroom. No one touched the pots, the bowls, or opened the fridge asking, "What's for dinner?" No one waited for him to come home. No one sent a message, "Text me when you get back." No one was upset, and no one was waiting. And at first, that hurt. Not because of loneliness, but because that emptiness revealed a truth. He had forgotten who he was. When he was no longer trying to hold someone close, that first night, he turned on the television just to have sound in the room. But it only made the house feel even emptier. Artificial sound couldn't cover up the truth. He had lived so long as someone who filled the emptiness for others, while he himself was hollow. He turned off the television, Saturday on the chair, silent, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't run, didn't do anything, didn't try to stay busy to avoid thinking, just sat and listened, not to music, but to himself, the part of him that had stayed silent for so long because no one let it speak. It said, "You're exhausted. You don't hate anyone, but you can't keep trading your peace just to be called a good man." It was a time no one saw. No photos. No inspirational status updates. Just him facing himself with no mask. No role. No defense. And in that seemingly endless season of emptiness, he began to understand, solitude is not isolation. It is a classroom, where men who once gave until they were drained are finally forced to sit still and relearn how to love themselves without needing anyone to certify that they're worthy. The one place no one else can invade. The first place where he didn't have to pretend to be okay. And the first place, in many years, where he realized he was still there. Not perfect, not flashy, but real. And just like that, the emptiness became a resting place. The silence became life. And being alone was no longer a punishment. It was a reward. For those who have hurt enough to stay with themselves, he no longer replies right away. Not because he's busy, not because he wants to prove something, but because he no longer lives in a reactive state. Before, every time his phone buzzed, he felt responsible to respond, even when he was tired, even when there was nothing to say, even on days his mind just wanted to rest. He used to fear people would think he was distant, cold, uncaring, so he replied quickly. He showed up on time. He was present, even when he felt empty inside. But now it's different. Now, he replies, when he truly wants to connect, not out of politeness, not out of obligation, but because within him, there's enough space to give sincerely, without pressure. He no longer goes to gatherings just to be polite, doesn't go to places where every conversation stays on the surface, where people ask, "How have you been?" but don't truly listen to the answer. He used to think maintaining relationships was part of being mature, but now he understands. Some relationships aren't meant to be maintained because they only exist when he's the one maintaining them. He's starting to rebuild a life that's not loud, not rushed, no longer filled with self-imposed obligations. Each day, he chooses to be around what makes him feel light. He quietly lets go of things that make him shrink, second guess, or tense up. He lives by new principles, not written down, not announced, but present in every small action. If a conversation makes him feel lesser, he steps away. If a relationship only exists when he initiates, he stops initiating the public. If someone only shows up when they need something, they don't need to return. He doesn't need to stand out. He just needs enough peace to breathe deeply without feeling tight in his chest. He doesn't need a crowd. Just a few people, genuine, unforced. He's not searching for something new, him. He's just shedding the old things that once made him lose himself. And in that process, he realizes peace isn't avoidance. It's a form of selection, a conscious, deliberate choice. Not everyone is invited into his world anymore. Not because he thinks he's above anyone, but because he used to be too lenient, with access to the point he got worn down by what people called connection. Oh, now, everything that passes through his life must be light, must be real, and must carry enough respect not to make him sacrifice himself again. It's not a grand transformation. Just a man, after losing himself for too long, finally beginning to rebuild, brick by brick, principle by principle, silence by silence, decision by decision. Keep what nourishes, let go of what drains. And from there, his life is no longer wide open to everyone, only just enough for what preserves peace. Now, he's not lonely, even though he lives alone, eats alone, sleeps in a room where no one else's breath fills the air beside him, because that no longer scares him. He wakes up earlier than before, not because anything urgent awaits, but because he loves the feeling of being awake while the world still sleeps. He walks into the kitchen, boils water, brews coffee like a ritual. No rush, no thought of who might be waiting. No, checking his phone. Just simply living, fully. Each sip of coffee no longer serves to recover from a sleepless night over someone. It's just coffee. Bitter, warm, real. Like the man he is now. He walks around the neighborhood. No earphones. No calls. No updates. He just looks at the trees, listens to the wind, feels his footsteps touching the groundlight. Real. Fully aware. He used to live as if he always needed someone beside him to confirm he was loved, that he mattered. He used to think, a good man is one who always has someone next to him. Not anymore. Now, he knows better. He knows no one can fill him if he doesn't sit down and listen to the part of himself he once neglected. No one can love him enough if he keeps living as a role instead of being himself. And the most beautiful thing he's learned through it all is not how to avoid pain, but how to stand after it. No one texts him every morning, but he doesn't feel lacking. No cozy dinner for two, but he doesn't feel empty. Because everything he's living, doing, preserving, is real. Not to prove anything to anyone. Not to keep anyone from leaving. Just so he never has to trade himself away again. A man like that doesn't need a crowd to feel seen. Doesn't need validation to know he matters. And doesn't need someone calling his name to not feel lost. Because he's called his own name again after forgetting it for a very long time. Now, he's not lonely, he's just alone. And alone, to him, no longer means empty. It means returning. It's a room with no one else, but full of presence. It's a morning with no messages, but full of real light. People ask, how can you live alone like that? He smiles. Doesn't explain Jesus, us, because the deepest things don't need to be expressed, only lived. And he is living truly for the first time in a very long while. And in this silence, he finally exhales without feeling incomplete. Only feeling, he's come home. People look at him and say he's cold, that he's not like he used to be, not as approachable, not as attentive, not as patient as before. But they don't know. None of them know how much he used to give, how soft-hearted he once was, how many times he chose to yield, how long he lived for others, to the point he forgot what he once wanted, once loved, once needed, to truly feel happy. They only see the man he is today, quiet, composed, no longer saying much, no longer holding on to what doesn't want to stay. They don't see the journey that brought him here, a long journey, full of breaking, full of moments he endured, just to keep something that was never really his. He doesn't hate love, never did. He only hates the feeling of having to trade himself in, just to be loved in return. The feeling of having to smile while swallowing exhaustion, the feeling of having to filter every word just to avoid hurting someone while no one asked if he was hurting. Not anymore. Now, if something makes him feel small, he leaves. If someone only shows up when they need something, he stays silent. If a kind of love demands self-sacrifice, he no longer takes part. Because he understands, real love doesn't ask anyone to disappear just to make someone else stay. It doesn't require a man to shrink himself just to fit into someone else's empty space. He's not cold. He's just clear. Clear about boundaries. Clear about worth. And clear about what's worth keeping and what's not. That man doesn't reject love. He just no longer accepts the kind of love that asks him to forget who he is. And if you even just once in your life had to take a step back to protect the peace you fought so hard to reclaim, leave a line. No need to be loud, no need to explain. Just one sentence that says everything. I'm not cold. I'm just done. Emder. And maybe someone out there needs that line to find themselves again. Just like you once did. Just like he did. Quietly, steadily, and at the right time.